stipulation and in schools exclusively designed for secular English instruction, to work upon the children's minds as they please, in order to smuggle in Christianity, against which the Hindus are most jealously on their guard. As I have said, childhood is the time to sow the seeds of belief, and not manhood, more especially where an earlier faith has taken root. An acquired conviction such as is feigned by adults is, as a rule, only the mask for some kind of personal interest. And it is the feeling that this is almost bound to be the case which makes a man who has changed his religion in mature years an object of contempt to most people everywhere, who thus show that they look upon religion, not as a matter of reasoned conviction, but merely as a belief inoculated in childhood, before any test can be applied. And that they are right in their view of religion is also obvious from the way in which not only the masses, who are blindly credulous, but also the clergy of every religion, who, as such, have faithfully and zealously studied its sources, foundations, dogmas, and disputed points, cleave as a body to the religion of their particular country. Consequently, for a minister of one religion or confession to go over to another is the rarest thing in the world. The Catholic clergy, for example, are fully convinced of the truth of all the tenets of their church, and so are the Protestant clergy of theirs, and both defend the principles of their creeds with like zeal. And yet the conviction is governed merely by the country native to each. To the South German ecclesiastic the truth of the Catholic dogma is quite obvious, to the North German, the Protestant. If then, these convictions are based on reasons, the reasons must be climatic, and thrive, like plants, some only here, some only there. The convictions of those who are thus locally convinced are taken on trust and believed by the masses everywhere. Demophils. Well, no harm is done, and it doesn't make any real difference. As a fact, Protestantism is more suited to the North, Catholicism to the South. Philolithes. So it seems. Still I take a higher standpoint, and keep in view a more important object, the progress, namely, of the knowledge of truth among mankind. And from this point of view, it is a terrible thing that wherever a man is born, certain propositions are inculcated in him in earliest youth, and he is assured that he may never have any doubts about them, under penalty of thereby forfeiting eternal salvation, propositions, I mean, which affect the foundation of all our other knowledge and accordingly determine forever, and, if they are false, distort forever, the point of view from which our knowledge starts, and as, further, the corollaries of these propositions touch the entire system of our intellectual attainments at every point, the whole of human knowledge is thoroughly adulterated by them. Evidence of this is afforded by every literature, the most striking by that of the Middle Age, but in a too considerable degree by that of the 15th and 16th centuries. Look at even the first minds of all those epochs, how paralyzed they are by false fundamental positions like these, how, more especially, all insight into the true constitution and working of nature is, as it were, blocked up. During the whole of the Christian period the ism lies like a mountain on all intellectual, and chiefly on all philosophical efforts, and arrests or stunts all progress. For the scientific men of these ages God, devil, angels, demons hid the whole of nature, no inquiry was followed to the end, nothing ever thoroughly examined, everything which went beyond the most obvious casual nexus was immediately set down to those personalities. It was at once explained by a reference to God, angels, or demons, as Pomponius expressed himself when the matter was being discussed, and philosophers at any rate have nothing analogous. There is, to be sure, a suspicion of irony in this statement of Pomponius, as his perfidy in other matters is known. Still, he is only giving expression to the general way of thinking of his age. And if, on the other hand, any one possessed the rare quality of an elastic mind, which alone could burst the bonds, his writings, and he himself with them were burnt, as happened to Bruno and Vanini. How completely an ordinary mind is paralyzed by that early preparation in metaphysics is seen in the most vivid way and on its most ridiculous side, where such a one undertakes to criticize the doctrines of an alien creed. The efforts of the man are generally found to be directed to a careful exhibition of the incongruity of its dogmas with those of his own belief. he is at great pains to show that not only do they not say, but certainly do not mean, the same thing, and with that he thinks, in his simplicity, that he has demonstrated the falsehood of the alien creed. He really never dreams of putting the question which of the two may be right. His own articles of belief he looks upon as priori true and certain principles. Demophils. So that's your higher point of view? I assure you there is a higher still. First live, then philosophize is a maxim of more comprehensive import than appears at first sight. The first thing to do is to control the raw and evil dispositions of the masses, so as to keep them from pushing injustice to extremes, and from committing cruel, violent, and disgraceful acts. If you were to wait until they had recognized and grasped the truth, you would undoubtedly come too late, and truth, supposing that it had been found, would surpass their powers of comprehension. In any case, an allegorical investiture of it, a parable or myth, is all that would be of any service to them. As Kant said, there must be a public standard of right and virtue, it must always flutter high overhead. It is a matter of indifference what heraldic figures are inscribed on it, so long as they signify what is meant. Such an allegorical representation of truth is always and everywhere, for humanity at large, a serviceable substitute for a truth to which it can never attain, for a philosophy which it can never grasp, let alone the fact that it is daily changing its shape, and has in no form as yet met with general acceptance. Practical aims, then, my good Philolaethes, are in every respect superior to theoretical. Philolaethes. Vivihat you say is very like the ancient advice of Timaeus of Locreus, the Pythagorean, stop the mind with falsehood if you can't speed it with truth. I almost suspect that your plan is the one which is so much in vogue just now, that you want to impress upon me that the hour is nighva when we may feast in quiet. You recommend us, in fact, to take timely precautions, so that the waves of the discontented raging masses mayn't disturb us at table. But the whole point of view is as false as it is nowadays popular and commended, and so I make haste to enter a protest against it. It is false, that state, justice, law cannot be upheld without the assistance of religion and its dogmas, and that justice and public order need religion as a necessary complement, if legislative enactments are to be carried out. It is false, were it repeated 100 times. An effective and striking argument to the contrary is afforded by the ancients, especially the Greeks. They had nothing at all of what we understand by religion. They had no sacred documents, no dogma to be learned and its acceptance furthered by everyone, its principles to be inculcated early on the young. Just as little was moral doctrine preached by the ministers of religion, nor did the priests trouble themselves about morality or about what the people did or left undone. Not at all. The duty of the priests was confined to temple ceremonial, prayers, _ns, sacrifices, processions, lustrations and the like, the object of which was anything but the moral improvement of the individual. Vivihat was called religion consisted, more especially in the cities, in giving temples here and there to some of the gods of the greater tribes, in which the worship described was carried on as a state matter, and was consequently, in fact, an affair of police. No one, except the functionaries performing, was in any way compelled to attend, or even to believe in it. In the whole of antiquity there is no trace of any obligation to believe in any particular dogma. Merely in the case of an open denial of the existence of the gods, or any other reviling of them, a penalty was imposed, and that on account of the insult offered to the state, which served those gods. Beyond this it was free to everyone to think of them what he pleased. If anyone wanted to gain the favor of those gods privately, by prayer or sacrifice, it was open to him to do so at his own expense and at his own risk. If he didn't do it, no one made any objection, least of all the state. In the case of the Romans, everyone had his own Lares and Penates at home. They were, however, in reality, only the venerated busts of ancestors. Of the immortality of the soul and a life beyond the grave, the ancients had no firm, clear or, least of all, dogmatically fixed idea, but very fluctuating, indefinite and problematical notions, everyone in his own way, and the ideas about the gods were just as varying, individual and vague. There was, therefore, really no religion, in our sense of the word, amongst the ancients. But did anarchy and lawlessness prevail amongst them on that account? Is not law and civil order, rather, so much their work, that it still forms the foundation of our own? Was there not complete protection for property, even though it consisted for the most part of slaves? And did not this state of things last for more than 1,000 years? So that I can't recognize, I must even protest against the practical aims and the necessity of religion in the sense indicated by you, and so popular nowadays, that dispensable foundation of all legislative arrangements. For, if as an you take that point of view, the pure and sacred endeavor after truth would, to say the least, appear quixotic, and even criminal, if it ventured, in its feeling of justice, to denounce the authoritative creed as a usurper who had taken possession of the throne of truth and maintained his position by keeping up the Demophils. But religion is not opposed to truth, it itself teaches truth. And as the range of its activity is not a narrow lecture room, but the world and humanity at large, religion must conform to the requirements and comprehension of an audience so numerous and so mixed. Religion must not let truth appear in its naked form, or, to use a medical simile, it must not exhibit it pure, but must employ a mythical vehicle, a medium, as it were. You can also compare truth in this respect to certain chemical stuffs which in themselves are gaseous, but which for medicinal uses, as also for preservation or transmission, must be bound to a stable, solid base, because they would otherwise volatilize. Chlorine gas, for example, is for all purposes applied only in the form of chlorides. But if truth, pure, abstract and free from all mythical alloy, is always to remain unattainable, even by philosophers, it might be compared to fluorine, which cannot even be isolated, but must always appear in combination with other elements. Or, to take a less scientific simile, truth, which is inexpressible except by means of myth and allegory, is like water, which can be carried about only in vessels. A philosopher who insists on obtaining it pure is like a man who breaks the jug in order to get the water by itself. This is, perhaps, an exact analogy. At any rate, religion is truth allegorically and mythically expressed, and so rendered attainable and digestible by mankind in general. Mankind couldn't possibly take it pure and unmixed, just as we can't breathe pure oxygen, we require an addition of 4 times its bulk in nitrogen. In plain language, the profound meaning, the high aim of life, can only be unfolded and presented to the masses symbolically, because they are incapable of grasping it in its true signification. Philosophy, on the other hand, should be like the Eleusinian mysteries, for the few, the elite. Philolithes. I understand. It comes, in short, to truth wearing the garment of falsehood. But in doing so it enters on a fatal alliance. A dangerous weapon is put into the hands of those who are authorized to employ falsehood as the vehicle of truth. If it is as you say, I fear the damage caused by the falsehood will be greater than any advantage the truth could ever produce. Of course, if the allegory were admitted to be such, I should raise no objection, but with the admission it would rob itself of all respect, and consequently, of all utility. The allegory must, therefore, put in a claim to be true in the proper sense of the word, and maintain the claim, while, at the most, it is true only in an allegorical sense. Here lies the irreparable mischief, the permanent evil, and this is why religion has always been and always will be in conflict with the noble endeavor after pure truth. Demophils. Oh no. That danger is guarded against. If religion mainly exactly confess its allegorical nature, it gives sufficient indication of it. Philolithes. How so? Demophils. In its mysteries. Mystery is in reality only a technical theological term for religious allegory. All religions have their mysteries. Properly speaking, a mystery is a dogma which is plainly absurd, but which, nevertheless, conceals in itself a lofty truth, and one which by itself would be completely incomprehensible to the ordinary understanding of the multitude. The multitude accepts it in this disguise on trust, and believes it, without being led astray by the absurdity of it, which even to its intelligence is obvious, and in this way it participates in the kernel of the matter so far as it is possible for it to do so. To explain what I mean, I may add that even in philosophy an attempt has been made to make use of a mystery. Pascal, for example, who was at once a pietist, a mathematician, and a philosopher, says in this threefold capacity, God is everywhere center and nowhere periphery. Malebranche has also the just remark, liberty is a mystery. One could go a step further and maintain that in religions everything is mystery. For to impart truth, in the proper sense of the word, to the multitude in its raw state is absolutely impossible. All that can fall to its lot is to be enlightened by a mythological reflection of it. Naked truth is out of place before the eyes of the profane vulgar, it can only make its appearance thickly veiled. Hence, it is unreasonable to require of a religion that it shall be true in the proper sense of the word, and this, I may observe in passing, is nowadays the absurd contention of rationalists and supernaturalists alike. Both start from the position that religion must be the real truth, and while the former demonstrate that it is not the truth, the latter obstinately maintain that it is, or rather, the former dress up and arrange the allegorical element in such a way, that, in the proper sense of the word, it could be true, but would in that case, a platitude, while the latter wish to maintain that it is true in the proper sense of the word, without any further dressing, a belief, which, as we ought to know is only to be enforced by inquisitions and the stake. As a fact, however, myth and allegory really form the proper element of religion, and under this indispensable condition, which is imposed by the intellectual limitation of the multitude, religion provides a sufficient satisfaction for those metaphysical requirements of mankind which are indestructible. It takes the place of that pure philosophical truth which is infinitely difficult and perhaps never attainable. Philolithes. Just as a wooden leg takes the place of a natural one, it supplies what is lacking, barely does duty for it, claims to be regarded as a natural leg, and is more or less artfully put together. The only difference is that, whilst a natural leg as a rule preceded the wooden one, religion has everywhere got the start of philosophy. Demophilus. That may be, but still for a man who hasn't a natural leg, a wooden one is of great service. You must bear in mind that the metaphysical needs of mankind absolutely require satisfaction, because the horizon of men's thoughts must have a background and not remain unbounded. Man has, as a rule, no faculty for weighing reasons and discriminating between what is false and what is true, and besides, the labor which nature and the needs of nature impose upon him, leaves him no time for such inquiries, or for the education which they presuppose. In his case, therefore, it is no use talking of a reasoned conviction, he has to fall back on belief and authority. If a really true philosophy were to take the place of religion, 9/10 at least of mankind would have to receive it on authority, that is to say, it too would be a matter of faith, for Plato's dictum, that the multitude can't be philosophers, will always remain true. Authority, however, is an affair of time and circumstance alone, and so it can't be bestowed on that which has only reason in its favor, it must accordingly be allowed to nothing but what has acquired it in the course of history, even if it is only an allegorical representation of truth. Truth in this form, supported by authority, appeals first of all to those elements in the human constitution which are strictly metaphysical, that is to say, to the need man feels of a theory in regard to the riddle of existence which forces itself upon his notice, a need arising from the consciousness that behind the physical in the world there is a metaphysical, something permanent as the foundation of constant change. Then it appeals to the will, to the fears and hopes of mortal beings living in constant struggle, for whom, accordingly, religion creates gods and demons whom they can cry to, appease and win over. Finally, it appeals to that moral consciousness which is undeniably present in man, lends to it that corroboration and support without which it would not easily maintain itself in the struggle against so many temptations. It is just from this side that religion affords an inexhaustible source of consolation and comfort in the innumerable trials of life, a comfort which does not leave men in death, but rather then only unfolds its full efficacy. So religion may be compared to one who takes a blind man by the hand and leads him, because he is unable to see for himself, whose concern it is to reach his destination, not to look at everything by the way. Philolathis. That is certainly the strong point of religion. If it is a fraud, it is a pious fraud, that is undeniable. But this makes priests something between deceivers and teachers of morality. They daren't teach the real truth, as you have quite rightly explained, even if they knew it, which is not the case. A true philosophy, then, can always exist, but not a true religion. True, I mean, in the proper understanding of the word, not merely in that flowery or allegorical sense which you have described, a sense in which all religions would be true, only in various degrees. It is quite in keeping with the inextricable mixture of weal and woe, honesty and good and evil, nobility and baseness, which is the average characteristic of the world everywhere, that the most important, the most lofty, the most sacred truths can make their appearance only in combination with a lie, can even borrow strength from a lie as from something that works more powerfully on mankind, and, as revelation, must be ushered in by a lie. This might, indeed, be regarded as the cachet of the moral world. However, we won't give up the hope that mankind will eventually reach a point of maturity and education at which it can on the one side produce, and on the other receive, the true philosophy. Simplex sigillum veri, the naked truth must be so simple and intelligible that it can be imparted to all in its true form, without any admixture of myth and fable, without disguising it in the form of religion. Demophils. You've no notion how stupid most people are. Philolathis. I am only expressing a hope which I can't give up. If it were fulfilled, truth in its simple and intelligible form would of course drive religion from the place it has so long occupied as its representative, and by that very means kept open for it. The time would have come when religion would have carried out her object and completed her course. The race she had brought to years of discretion she could dismiss, and herself depart in peace. That would be the euthanasia of religion. But as long as she lives, she has two faces, one of truth, one of fraud. According as you look at one or the other, you will bear her favor or ill will. Religion must be regarded as a necessary evil, its necessity resting on the pitiful of the great majority of mankind, incapable of grasping the truth, and therefore requiring, in its pressing need, something to take its place. Demophils. Really, one would think that you philosophers had truth in a cupboard, and that all you had to do was to go and get it. Philolathis. Well, if we haven't got it, it is chiefly owing to the pressure put upon philosophy by religion at all times and in all places. People have tried to make the expression and communication of truth, even the contemplation and discovery of it, impossible, by putting children, in their earliest years, into the hands of priests to be manipulated, to have the lines, in which their fundamental thoughts are henceforth to run, laid down with such firmness as, in essential matters, to be fixed and determined for this whole life. Vivien, I take up the writings even of the best intellects of the 16th and 17th centuries, more especially if I have been engaged in Oriental studies. I am sometimes shocked to see how they are paralyzed and hemmed in on all sides by Jewish ideas. How can anyone think out the true philosophy when he is prepared like this? Demophils. Even if the true philosophy were to be discovered, religion wouldn't disappear from the world, as you seem to think. There can't be one system of metaphysics for everybody. That's rendered impossible by the natural differences of intellectual power between man, and the differences, too, which education makes. It is a necessity for the great majority of mankind to engage in that severe bodily labor which cannot be dispensed with if the ceaseless requirements of the whole race are to be satisfied. Not only does this leave the majority no time for education, for learning, for contemplation, but by virtue of the hard and fast antagonism between muscles and mind, the intelligence is blunted by so much exhausting bodily labor, and becomes heavy, clumsy, awkward, and consequently incapable of grasping any other than quite simple situations. At least 9/10 of the human race falls under this category. But still the people require a system of metaphysics, that is, an account of the world and our existence, because such an account belongs to the most natural needs of mankind. They require a popular system, and to be popular it must combine many rare qualities. It must be easily understood, and at the same time possess, on the proper points, a certain amount of obscurity, even of impenetrability. Then a correct and satisfactory system of morality must be bound up with its dogmas. Above all, it must afford inexhaustible consolation in suffering and death. The consequence of all this is, that it can only be true in an allegorical and not in a real sense. Further, it must have the support of an authority which is impressive by its great age, by being universally recognized, by its documents, their tone and utterances, qualities which are so extremely difficult to combine that many a man wouldn't be so ready, if he considered the matter, to help to undermine a religion, but would reflect that what he is attacking is a people's most sacred treasure. If you want to form an opinion on religion, you should always bear in mind the character of the great multitude for which it is destined, and form a picture to yourself of its complete inferiority, moral and intellectual. It is incredible how far this inferiority goes, and how perseveringly a spark of truth will glimmer on even under the crudest covering of monstrous fable or grotesque ceremony, clinging indestructibly, like the odor of musk, to everything that has once come into contact with it. In illustration of this, consider the profound #DOM of the Upanishads, and then look at the meta-idolatry in the India of today, with its pilgrimages, processions, and festivities, or at the insane and ridiculous goings-on of the sannyasi. Still one can't deny that in all this insanity and nonsense there lies some obscure purpose which accords with, or is a reflection of the profound wisdom I mentioned. But for the brute multitude, it had to be dressed up in this form. In such a contrast as this we have the two poles of humanity, the wisdom of the individual and the bestiality of the many, both of which find their point of contact in the moral sphere. That saying from the Kurl must occur to everybody. Base people look like men, but I have never seen their exact counterpart. The man of education may, all the same, interpret religion to himself cum grano salis. The man of learning, the contemplative spirit, may secretly exchange it for a philosophy. But here again one philosophy wouldn't suit everybody. By the laws of affinity every system would draw to itself that public to whose education and capacities it was most suited. So there is always an inferior metaphysical system of the schools for the educated multitude, and a higher one for the elite. Kant's lofty doctrine, for instance, had to be degraded to the level of the schools and ruined by such men as Fries, Krug, and Salad. In short, here, if anywhere, Goethe's maxim is true: one does not suit all. Pure faith in revelation and pure metaphysics are for the two extremes, and for the intermediate steps mutual modifications of both in innumerable combinations and gradations. And this is rendered necessary by the immeasurable differences which nature and education have placed between man and man. Philolaethes. The view you take reminds me seriously of the mysteries of the ancients, which you mentioned just now. Their fundamental purpose seems to have been to remedy the evil arising from the differences of intellectual capacity and education. The plan was, out of the great multitude utterly impervious to unveiled truth, to select certain persons who might have it revealed to them up to a given point, out of these, again, to choose others to whom more would be revealed, as being able to grasp more, and so on up to the epopts. These grades correspond to the little, greater, and greatest mysteries. The arrangement was founded on a correct estimate of the intellectual inequality of mankind. Demophilus. To some extent the education in our lower, middle, and high schools corresponds to the varying grades of initiation into the mysteries. Philolaethes. In a very approximate way, and then only in so far as subjects of higher knowledge are written about exclusively in Latin. But since that has ceased to be the case, all the mysteries are profaned. Demophilus. However that may be, I wanted to remind you that you should look at religion more from the practical than from the theoretical side. Personified metaphysics may be the enemy of religion, but all the same personified morality will be its friend. Perhaps the metaphysical element in all religions is false, but the moral element in all is true. This might perhaps be presumed from the fact that they all disagree in their metaphysics, but are in accord as regards morality. Philolaethes. Vivhich is an illustration of the rule of logic that false premises may give a true conclusion. Demophilus. Let me hold you to your conclusion. Let me remind you that religion has two sides. If it can't stand when looked at from its theoretical, that is, its intellectual side, on the other hand, from the moral side, it proves itself the only means of guiding, controlling, and mollifying those races of animals endowed with reason, whose kinship with the ape does not exclude a kinship with the tiger. But at the same time religion is, as a rule, a sufficient satisfaction for their dull metaphysical necessities. You don't seem to me to possess a proper idea of the difference, wide as the heavens asunder, the deep gulf between your man of learning and enlightenment, accustomed to the process of thinking, and the heavy, clumsy, dull, and sluggish consciousness of humanity's beasts of burden, whose thoughts have once and for all taken the direction of anxiety about their livelihood, and cannot be put in motion in any other, whose muscular strength is so exclusively brought into play that the nervous power, which makes intelligence, sinks to a very low ebb. People like that must have something tangible which they can lay hold of on the slippery and thorny pathway of their life, some sort of beautiful fable, by means of which things can be imparted to them which their crude intelligence can entertain only in picture and parable. Profound explanations and fine distinctions are thrown away upon them. If you conceive religion in this light, and recollect that its aims are above all practical, and only in a subordinate degree theoretical, it will appear to you as something worthy of the highest respect. Philolaethes. A respect which will finally rest upon the principle that the end sanctifies the means. I don't feel in favor of a compromise on a basis like that. Religion may be an excellent means of training the perverse, obtuse, and ill-disposed members of the bipt race. In the eyes of the friend of truth every fraud, even though it be a pious one, is to be condemned. A system of deception, a pack of lies, would be a strange means of inculcating virtue. The flag to which I have taken the oath is truth. I shall remain faithful to it everywhere, and whether I succeed or not, I shall fight for light and truth. If I see religion on the wrong side, Demophilus. But you won't. Religion isn't a deception, it is true and the most important of all truths. Because its doctrines are, as I have said, of such a lofty kind that the multitude can't grasp them without an intermediary, because, I say, its light would blind the ordinary eye, it comes forward wrapped in the veil of allegory and teaches, not indeed what is exactly true in itself, but what is true in respect of the lofty meaning contained in it, and, understood in this way, religion is the truth. Philolaethes. It would be all right if religion were only at liberty to be true in a merely allegorical sense. But its contention is that it is downright true in the proper sense of the word. Herein lies the deception, and it is here that the friend of truth must take up a hostile position. Demophilus. The deception is a sine qua non. If religion were to admit that it was only the allegorical meaning in its doctrine which was true, it would rob itself of all efficacy. Such rigorous treatment as this would destroy its invaluable influence on the hearts and morals of mankind. Instead of insisting on that with pedantic obstinacy, look at its great achievements in the practical sphere, its furtherance of good and kindly feelings, its guidance in conduct, the support and consolation it gives to suffering humanity in life and death. How much you ought to guard against letting theoretical cavils discredit in the eyes of the multitude, and finally wrest from it, something which is an inexhaustible source of consolation and tranquility, something which, in its hard lot, it needs so much, even more than we do. On that score alone, religion should be free from attack. Philolaethes. With that kind of argument you could have driven Luther from the field, when he attacked the sale of indulgences. How many a one got consolation from the letters of indulgence, a consolation which nothing else could give, a complete tranquility, so that he joyfully departed with the fullest confidence in the packet of them which he held in his hand at the hour of death, convinced that they were so many cards of admission to all the 9 heavens. Vivat is the use of grounds of consolation and tranquility which are constantly overshadowed by the Damocles sword of illusion. The truth, my dear sir, is the only safe thing, the truth alone remains steadfast and trusty, it is the only solid consolation, it is the indestructible diamond. Demophilus. Yes, if you had truth in your pocket, ready to favor us with it on demand. All you've got are metaphysical systems, in which nothing is certain but the headaches they cost. Before you take anything away, you must have something better to put in its place. Philolaethes. That's what you keep on saying. To free a man from error is to give, not to take away. Knowledge that a thing is false is a truth. Error always does harm, sooner or later it will bring mischief to the man who harbors it. Then give up deceiving people, confess ignorance of what you don't know, and leave everyone to form his own articles of faith for himself. Perhaps they won't turn out so bad, especially as they'll rub one another's corners down, and mutually rectify mistakes. The existence of many views will at any rate lay a foundation of tolerance. Those who possess knowledge and capacity may betake themselves to the study of philosophy, or even in their own persons carry the history of philosophy a step further. Demophils. That'll be a pretty business. A whole nation of metaphysicians, wrangling and eventually coming to blows with one another. Philolaethes. Well, a few blows here and there are the sauce of life, or at any rate a very inconsiderable evil compared with such things as priestly dominion, plundering of the laity, persecution of heretics, courts of inquisition, crusades, religious wars, massacres of Saint Bartholomew. These have been the result of popular metaphysics imposed from without, so I stick to the old saying that you can't get grapes from thistles, nor expect good to come from a pack of lies. Demophils. How often must I repeat that religion is anything but a pack of lies? It is truth itself, only in a mythical, allegorical vesture. But when you spoke of your plan of everyone being his own founder of religion, I wanted to say that a particularism like this is totally opposed to human nature, and would consequently destroy all social order. Man is a metaphysical animal, that is to say, he has paramount metaphysical necessities. Accordingly, he conceives life above all in its metaphysical signification, and wishes to bring everything into line with that. Consequently, however strange it may sound in view of the uncertainty of all dogmas, agreement in the fundamentals of metaphysics is the chief thing, because a genuine and lasting bond of union is only possible among those who are of one opinion on these points. As a result of this, the main point of likeness and of contrast between nations is rather religion than government, or even language, and so the fabric of society, the state, will stand firm only when founded on a system of metaphysics which is acknowledged by all. This, of course, can only be a popular system, that is, a religion. It becomes part and parcel of the constitution of the state, of all the public manifestations of the national life, and also of all solemn acts of individuals. This was the case in ancient India, among the Persians, Egyptians, Jews, Greeks, and Romans. It is still the case in the Brahmin, Buddhist and Mohammedan nations. In China there are three faiths, it is true, of which the most prevalent Buddhism is precisely the one which is not protected by the state. Still, there is a saying in China, universally acknowledged, and of daily application, that the three faiths are only one, that is to say, they agree in essentials. The emperor confesses all three together at the same time. And Europe is the union of Christian states. Christianity is the basis of every one of the members, and the common bond of all. Hence Turkey, though geographically in Europe, is not properly to be reckoned as belonging to it. In the same way, the European princes hold their place, by the grace of God, and the Pope is the vicegerent of God. Accordingly, as his throne was the highest, he used to wish all thrones to be regarded as held in fee from him. In the same way, too, archbishops and bishops, as such, possessed temporal power, and in England they still have seats and votes in the upper house. Protestant princes, as such, are heads of their churches. In England, a few years ago, this was a girl 18 years old. By the revolt from the Pope, the Reformation shattered the European fabric, and in a special degree dissolved the true unity of Germany by destroying its common religious faith. This union, which had practically come to an end, had, accordingly, to be restored later on by artificial and purely political means. You see, then, how closely connected a common faith is with the social order and the constitution of every state. Faith is everywhere the support of the laws and the constitution, the foundation, therefore, of the social fabric, which could hardly hold together at all if religion did not lend weight to the authority of government and the dignity of the ruler. Philolaethes. Oh, yes, princes use God as a kind of bogey to frighten grown-up children to bed with, if nothing else avails, that's why they attach so much importance to the deity. Very well. Let me, in passing, recommend our rulers to give their serious attention, regularly twice every year, to the 15th chapter of the first book of Samuel, that they may be constantly reminded of what it means to prop the throne on the altar. Besides, since the stake, that ultima ration theologorum, has gone out of fashion, this method of government has lost its efficacy. For, as you know, religions are like glowworms, they shine only when it is dark. A certain amount of general ignorance is the condition of all religions, the element in which alone they can exist. And as soon as astronomy, natural science, geology, history, the knowledge of countries and peoples have spread their light broadcast, and philosophy finally is permitted to say a word, every faith founded on miracles and revelation must disappear, and philosophy takes its place. In Europe the day of knowledge and science dawned towards the end of the 15th century with the appearance of the Renaissance Platonists. Its sun rose higher in the 16th and 17th centuries so rich in results, and scattered the mists of the Middle Age. Church and faith were compelled to disappear in the same proportion, and so in the 18th century English and French philosophers were able to take up an attitude of direct hostility, until, finally, under Frederick the Great, Kant appeared, and took away from religious belief the support it had previously enjoyed from philosophy. He emancipated the handmaid of theology, and in attacking the question with German thoroughness and patience, gave it an earnest instead of a frivolous tone. The consequence of this is that we see Christianity undermined in the 19th century, a serious faith in it almost completely gone. We see it fighting even for bare existence, whilst anxious princes fry to set it up a little by artificial means, as a doctor uses a drug on a dying patient. In this connection there is a passage in Condorcet's De Progrès de l'Esprit Humain, which looks as if written as a warning to our age. The religious zeal shown by philosophers and great men was only a political devotion, and every religion which allows itself to be defended as a belief that may usefully be left to the people, can only hope for an agony more or less prolonged. In the whole course of the events which I have indicated, you may always observe that faith and knowledge are related as the two scales of a balance. When the one goes up, the other goes down. So sensitive is the balance that it indicates momentary influences. Vimy, for instance, at the beginning of this century, those inroads of French robbers under the leadership of Bonaparte, and the enormous efforts necessary for driving them out and punishing them, had brought about a temporary neglect of science and consequently a certain decline in the general increase of knowledge. The Church immediately began to raise her head again and faith began to show fresh signs of life, which, to be sure, in keeping with the times, was partly poetical in its nature. On the other hand, in the more than 30 years of peace which followed, leisure and prosperity furthered the building up of science and the spread of knowledge in an extraordinary degree, the consequence of which is what I have indicated, the dissolution and threatened fall of religion. Perhaps the time is approaching which has so often been prophesied, when religion will take her departure from European humanity. Like a nurse which the child has outgrown, the child will now be given over to the instructions of a tutor. For there is no doubt that religious doctrines which are founded merely on authority, miracles, and revelations, are only suited to the childhood of humanity. Everyone will admit that a race, the past duration of which on the earth all accounts, physical and historical, agree in placing it not more than some 100 times the life of a man of 60, is as yet only in its first childhood. Demophilus. Instead of taking an undisguised pleasure in prophesying the downfall of Christianity, how I wish you would consider what a measureless debt of gratitude European humanity owes to it, how greatly it has benefited by the religion which, after a long interval, followed it from its old home in the East. Europe received from Christianity ideas which were quite new to it, the knowledge, I mean, of the fundamental truth that life cannot be an end in itself, that the true end of our existence lies beyond it. The Greeks and Romans had placed this end altogether in our present life, so that in this sense they may certainly be called blind heathens. And, keeping with this view of life, all their virtues can be reduced to what is serviceable to the community, to what is useful in fact. Aristotle says quite naively, those virtues must necessarily be the greatest which are the most useful to others. So the ancients thought patriotism the highest virtue, although it is really a very doubtful one, since narrowness, prejudice, vanity and an enlightened self-interest are main elements in it. Just before the passage I quoted, Aristotle enumerates all the virtues, in order to discuss them singly. They are justice, courage, temperance, magnificence, magnanimity, liberality, gentleness, good, and wisdom. How different from the Christian virtues! Plato himself, incomparably the most transcendental philosopher of pre-Christian antiquity, knows no higher virtue than justice, and he alone recommends it unconditionally and for its own sake, whereas the rest make a happy life, vita the aim of all virtue, and moral conduct the way to attain it. Christianity freed European humanity from this shallow, crude identification of itself with the hollow, uncertain existence of every day, qui luncturi jussit, et erectos ad sidera tolera voltus. Christianity, accordingly, does not preach mere justice, but the love of mankind, compassion, good works, forgiveness, love of your enemies, patience, humility, resignation, faith, and hope. It even went a step further, and taught that the world is of evil, and that we need deliverance. It preached despisal of the world, self-denial, chastity, giving up of one's will, that is, turning away from life and its illusory pleasures. It taught the healing power of pain, an instrument of torture is the symbol of Christianity. I am quite ready to admit that this earnest, this only correct view of life was thousands of years previously spread all over Asia in other forms, as it is still, independently of Christianity, but for European humanity it was a new and great revelation. For it is well known that the population of Europe consists of Asiatic races driven out as wanderers from their own homes, and gradually settling down in Europe. On their wanderings these races lost the original religion of their homes, and with it the right view of life, so, under a new sky, they formed religions for themselves, which were rather crude, the worship of Odin, for instance, the Druidic or the Greek religion, the metaphysical content of which was little and shallow. In the meantime the Greeks developed a special, one might almost say, an instinctive sense of beauty, belonging to them alone of all the nations who have ever existed on the earth, peculiar, fine and exact, so that their mythology took, in the mouth of their poets, and in the hands of their artists, an exceedingly beautiful and pleasing shape. On the other hand, the true and deep significance of life was lost to the Greeks and Romans. They lived on like grown-up children, till Christianity came and recalled them to the serious side of existence. Philolithes. And to see the effects one need only compare antiquity with the Middle Age, the time of Pericles, say, with the 14th century. You could scarcely believe you were dealing with the same kind of the finest development of humanity, excellent institutions, wise laws, shrewdly apportioned offices, rationally ordered freedom, all the arts, including poetry and philosophy, at their best, the production of works which, after thousands of years, are unparalleled, the creations, as it were, of a higher order of beings, which we can never imitate, life embellished by the noblest fellowship, as portrayed in Xenophon's Banquet. Look on the other picture, if you can, a time at which the Church had enslaved the minds, and violenced the bodies of men, that knights and priests might lay the whole weight of life upon the common beast of burden, the third estate. There, you have might as right, feudalism and fanaticism in close alliance, and in their train abominable ignorance and darkness of mind, a corresponding intolerance, discord of creeds, religious wars, crusades, inquisitions and persecutions, as the form of fellowship, chivalry, compounded of savagery and folly, with its pedantic system of ridiculous false pretenses carried to an extreme, its degrading superstition and apish veneration for women. Gallantry is the residue of this veneration, deservedly requited as it is by feminine arrogance. It affords continual food for laughter to all Asiatics, and the Greeks would have joined in it. In the Golden Middle Age the practice developed into a regular and methodical service of women. It imposed deeds of heroism, corps d'amour, bombastic troubadour songs, etc., although it is to be observed that these last buffooneries, which had an intellectual side, were chiefly at home in France, whereas amongst the material sluggish Germans, the knights distinguished themselves rather by drinking and stealing. They were good at boozing and filling their castles ft plunder, though in the courts, to be sure, there was no lack of insipid love songs. IA had caused this utter transformation? Migration and Christianity. Demophils. I am glad you reminded me of it. Migration was the source of the evil, Christianity the dam on which it broke. It was chiefly by Christianity that the raw, wild hordes which came flooding in were controlled and tamed. The savage man must first of all learn to kneel, to venerate, to obey, after that he can be civilized. This was done in Ireland by St. Patrick, in Germany by Winifred the Saxon, who was a genuine Boniface. It was migration of peoples, the last advance of Asiatic races towards Europe, followed only by the fruitless attempts of those under Attila, Zenghiz Khan, and Timur, and as a comic after-piece, by the Gypsies. It was this movement which swept away the humanity of the ancients. Christianity was precisely the principle which set itself to work against this savagery, just as later, through the whole of the Middle Age, the Church and its hierarchy were most necessary to set limits to the savage barbarism of those masters of violence, the princes and knights. It was what broke up the ice floes in that mighty deluge. Still, the chief aim of Christianity is not so much to make this life pleasant as to render us worthy of a better. It looks away over this span of time, over this fleeting dream, and seeks to lead us to eternal welfare. Its tendency is ethical in the highest sense of the word, a sense unknown in Europe till its advent, as I have shown you, by putting the morality and religion of the ancients side by side with those of Christendom. Philolaethes. You are quite right as regards theory, but look at the practice. In comparison with the ages of Christianity, the ancient world was unquestionably less cruel than the Middle Age, with its deaths by exquisite torture, its innumerable burnings at the stake. The ancients, further, were very enduring, laid great stress on justice, frequently sacrificed themselves for their country, showed such traces of every kind of magnanimity, and such genuine manliness, that to this day an acquaintance with their thoughts and actions is called the study of humanity. The fruits of Christianity were religious wars, butcheries, crusades, inquisitions, extermination of the natives in America, and the introduction of African slaves in their place, and among the ancients there is nothing analogous to this, nothing that can be compared with it, for the slaves of the ancients, the familia, the verni, were a contented race, and faithfully devoted to their master's service, and as different from the miserable Negroes of the sugar plantations, which are a disgrace to humanity, as their two colors are distinct. Those special moral delinquencies for which we reproach the ancients, and which are perhaps less uncommon nowadays than appears on the surface to be the case, are trifles compared with the Christian enormities I have mentioned. Can you then, all considered, maintain that mankind has been really made morally better by Christianity? Demophils. If the results haven't everywhere been in keeping with the purity and truth of the doctrine, it may be because the doctrine has been too noble, too elevated for mankind, that its aim has been placed too high. It was so much easier to come up to the heathen system, or to the Mohammedan. It is precisely what is noble and dignified that is most liable everywhere to misuse and fraud, abusus optimi pessimis. Those high doctrines have accordingly now and then served as a pretext for the most abominable proceedings, and for acts of unmitigated wickedness. The downfall of the institutions of the Old World, as well as of its arts and sciences, is, as I have said, to be attributed to the inroad of foreign barbarians. The inevitable result of this inroad was that ignorance and savagery got the upper hand, consequently violence and knavery established their dominion, and knights and priests became a burden to mankind. It is partly, however, to be explained by the fact that the new religion made eternal and not temporal welfare the object of desire, taught that simplicity of heart was to be preferred to knowledge, and looked askance at all worldly pleasure. Now the arts and sciences subserve worldly pleasure, but in so far as they could be made serviceable to religion they were promoted, and attained a certain degree of perfection. Philolaethes. In a very narrow sphere. The sciences were suspicious companions, and as such, were placed under restrictions. On the other hand, darling ignorance, that element so necessary to a system of faith, was carefully nourished. Demophils. And yet mankind's possessions in the way of knowledge up to that period, which were preserved in the writings of the ancients, were saved from destruction by the clergy, especially by those in the monasteries. How would it have fared if Christianity hadn't come in just before the migration of peoples? Philolaethes. It would really be a most useful inquiry to try and make, with the coldest impartiality, an unprejudiced, careful and accurate comparison of the advantages and disadvantages which may be put down to religion. For that, of course, a much larger knowledge of historical and psychological data than either of us command would be necessary. Academies might make it a subject for a prize essay. Demophils. They'll take care not to do so. Philolaethes. I'm surprised to hear you say that. It's a bad lookout for religion. However, there are academies which, in proposing a subject for competition, make it a secret condition that the prize is to go to the man who best interprets their own view. If we could only begin by getting a statistician to tell us how many crimes are prevented every year by religious, and how many by other motives, there would be very few of the former. If a man feels tempted to commit a crime, you may rely upon it that the first consideration which enters his head is the penalty appointed for it, and the chances that it will fall upon him. Then comes, as a second consideration, the risk to his reputation. If I am not mistaken, he will ruminate by the hour on these two impediments, before he ever takes a thought of religious considerations. If he gets safely over those two first bulwarks against crime, I think religion alone will very rarely hold him back from it. Demophils. I think that it will very often do so, when its influence works through the medium of custom. An atrocious act is at once felt to be repulsive. Is this but the effect of early impressions? Think, for instance, how often a man, especially if of noble birth, will make tremendous sacrifices to perform what he has promised, motived entirely by the fact that his father has often earnestly impressed upon him in his childhood that a man of honor, or a gentleman, or a cavalier, always keeps his word inviolate. Philolaethes. That's no use unless there is a certain inborn honorableness. You mustn't ascribe to religion what results from innate goodness of character, by which compassion for the man who would suffer by his crime keeps a man from committing it. This is the genuine moral motive, and as such it is independent of all religions. Demophils. But this is a motive which rarely affects the multitude unless it assumes a religious aspect. The religious aspect at any rate strengthens its power for good. Yet without any such natural foundation, religious motives alone are powerful to prevent crime. We need not be surprised at this in the case of the multitude, when we see that even people of education pass now and then under the influence, not indeed of religious motives, which are founded on something which is at least allegorically true, but of the most absurd superstition, and allow themselves to be guided by it all their life long, as, for instance, undertaking nothing on a Friday, refusing to sit down 13 at a table, obeying chance omens, and the like. How much more likely is the multitude to be guided by such things? You can't form any adequate idea of the narrow limits of the mind in its raw state. It is a place of absolute darkness, especially when, as often happens, a bad, unjust and malicious heart is at the bottom of it. People in this condition, and they form the great bulk of humanity, must be led and controlled as well as may be, even if it be by really superstitious motives, until such time as they become susceptible to truer and better ones. As an instance of the direct working of religion, may be cited the fact, common enough, in Italy especially, of a thief restoring stolen goods, through the influence of his confessor, who says he won't absolve him if he doesn't. Think again of the case of an oath, where religion shows a most decided influence, whether it be that a man places himself expressly in the position of a purely moral being, and as such looks upon himself as solemnly appealed to, as seems to be the case in France, where the formula is simply JELE jur, and also among the Quakers, whose solemn yea or nay is regarded as a substitute for the oath, or whether it be that a man really believes he is pronouncing something which may affect his eternal happiness, a belief which is presumably only the investiture of the former feeling. At any rate, religious considerations are a means of awakening and calling out a man's moral nature. How often it happens that a man agrees to take a false oath, and then, when it comes to the point, suddenly refuses, and truth and right win the day. Philolaethes. Oftener still false oaths are really taken, and truth and right trampled underfoot, though all witnesses of the oath know it well. Still, you are quite right to quote the oath as an undeniable example of the practical efficacy of religion. But, in spite of all you've said, I doubt whether the efficacy of religion goes much beyond this. Just think, if a public proclamation were suddenly made announcing the repeal of all the criminal laws, I fancy neither you nor I would have the courage to go home from here under the protection of religious motives. If, in the same way, all religions were declared untrue, we could, under the protection of the laws alone, go on living as without any special addition to our apprehensions or our measures of precaution. I will go, please, and say that religions have very frequently exercised a decidedly demoralizing influence. One may say generally that duties towards God and duties towards humanity are in inverse ratio. It is easy to let adulation of the deity make amends for lack of proper behavior towards man. And so we see that in all times and in all countries the great majority of mankind find it much easier to their way to heaven by prayers than to deserve to go there by their actions. In every religion it soon comes to be the case that faith, ceremonies, rites, and the like, are proclaimed to be more agreeable to the divine will than moral actions. The former, especially if they are bound up with the emoluments of the clergy, gradually come to be looked upon as a substitute for the latter. Sacrifices in temples, the saying of masses, the founding of chapels, the planting of crosses by the roadside, soon come to be the most meritorious works, so that even great crimes are expiated by them, as also by penance, to priestly authority, confessions, pilgrimages, donations to the temples and the clergy, the building of monasteries and the like. The consequence of all this is that the priests finally appear as middlemen in the corruption of the gods. And if matters don't go quite so far as that, where is the religion whose adherents don't consider prayers, praise and manifold acts of devotion a substitute, at least in part, for moral conduct? Look at England, where by an audacious piece of priestcraft, the Christian Sunday, introduced by Constantine the Great as a subject for the Jewish Sabbath, is in a mendacious way identified with it, and takes its name, and this in order that the commands of Jehovah for the Sabbath, that is, the day on which the Almighty had to rest from his 6 days' labor, so that it is essentially the last day of the week, might be applied to the Christian Sunday, the dies solis, the first day of the week, which the sun opens in glory, the day of devotion and joy. The consequence of this fraud is that Sabbath breaking, or the desecration of the Sabbath, that is, the slightest occupation, whether of business or pleasure, all games, music, sewing, worldly books, are on Sundays looked upon as great sins. Surely the man must believe that if, as his spiritual guides impress upon him, he is only constant in a strict observance of the holy Sabbath, and is regular attendant at divine service, that is, if he only invariably idles away his time on Sundays, and doesn't fail to sit 2 hours in church to hear the same litany for the 1000th time and mutter it in tune with the others, he may reckon on indulgence in regard to those little peccadillos which he occasionally allows himself. Those devils in human form, the slave owners and slave traders in the free states of North America, they should be called the slave states, are, as a rule, orthodox, pious Anglicans who would consider it a grave sin to work on Sundays, and having confidence in this, and their regular attendance at church, they hope for eternal happiness. The demoralizing tendency of religion is less problematical than its moral influence. How great and how certain that moral influence must be to make amends for the enormities which religions, especially the Christian and Mohammedan religions, have produced and spread over the earth. Think of the fanaticism, the endless persecutions, the religious wars, that sanguinary frenzy of which the ancients had no conception. Think of the Crusades, a butchery lasting 200 years and inexcusable, its war cry, "It is the will of God," its object to gain possession of the grave of one who preached love and sufferance. Think of the cruel expulsion and extermination of the Moors and Jews from Spain. Think of the orgies of blood, the Inquisitions, the heretical tribunals, the bloody and terrible conquests of the Mohammedans in 3 continents, or those of Christianity in America, whose inhabitants were for the most part, and in Cuba entirely, exterminated. According to Los Cases, Christianity murdered 12 millions in 40 years, of course all in majorum Dei gloriam, and for the propagation of the gospel, and because what wasn't Christian wasn't even looked upon as human. I have, it is true, touched upon these matters before, but when in our day, we hear of latest news from the kingdom of God, we shall not be weary of bringing old news to mind. And above all, don't let us forget India, the cradle of the human race, or at least of that part of it to which we belong, where first Mohammedans, and then Christians, were most cruelly infuriated against the adherents of the original faith of mankind. The destruction or disfigurement of the ancient temples and idols, a lamentable, mischievous and barbarous act, still bears witness to the monotheistic fury of the Mohammedans, carried on from Mahmud, the Ghaznavid of cursed memory, down to Aurangzeb, the fratricide, whom the Portuguese Christians have zealously imitated by destruction of temples and the auto da fe of the Inquisition at Goa. Don't let us forget the chosen people of God, who after they had, by Jehovah's express command, stolen from their old and trusty friends in Egypt the gold and silver vessels which had been lent to them, made a murderous and plundering inroad into the promised land, with the murderer Moses at their head, to tear it from the rightful owners, again, by the same Jehovah's express and repeated commands, showing no mercy, exterminating the inhabitants, women, children, and all, Joshua, ch. 9 and 10. And all this, simply because they weren't circumcised and didn't know Jehovah, which was reason enough to justify every enormity against them, just as for the same reason, in earlier times, the infamous knavery of the patriarch Jacob and his chosen people against Hamor, king of Shalem, and his people, is reported to his glory because the people were unbelievers. Genesis XXXII. 18. Truly, it is the worst side of religions that the believers of one religion have allowed themselves every sin against those of another, and with the utmost ruffianism and cruelty persecuted them, the Mohammedans against the Christians and Hindus, the Christians against the Hindus, Mohammedans, American natives, Negroes, Jews, heretics, and others. Perhaps I go too far in saying all religions. For the sake of truth, I must add that the fanatical enormities perpetrated in the name of religion are only to be put down to the adherents of monotheistic creeds, that is, the Jewish faith and its 2 branches, Christianity and Islamism. We hear of nothing of the kind in the case of Hindus and Buddhists. Although it is a matter of common knowledge that about the 5th century of our era Buddhism was driven out by the Brahmans from its ancient home in the southernmost part of the Indian peninsula, and afterwards spread over the whole of the rest of Asia, as far as I know, we have no definite account of any crimes of violence, or wars, or cruelties, perpetrated in the course of it. That may, of course, be attributable to the obscurity which veils the history of those countries, but the exceedingly mild character of their religion, together with their unceasing inculcation of forbearance towards all living things, and the fact that Brahmanism by its caste system properly admits no proselytes, allows one to hope that their adherents may be acquitted of shedding blood on a large scale, and of cruelty in any form. Spence Hardy, in his excellent book on Eastern Monachism, praises the extraordinary tolerance of the Buddhists, and adds his assurance that the annals of Buddhism will furnish fewer instances of religious persecution than those of any other religion. As a matter of fact, it is only to monotheism that intolerance is essential, and only God is by his nature a jealous who can allow no other God to exist. Polytheistic gods, on the other hand, are naturally tolerant, they live and let live. Their own colleagues are the chief objects of their sufferance, as being gods of the same religion. This toleration is afterwards extended to foreign who are, accordingly, hospitably received, and later on admitted, in some cases, to an equality of rights, the chief example of which is shown by the fact that the Romans willingly admitted and venerated Phrygian, Egyptian and other gods. Hence it is that monotheistic religions alone furnish the spectacle of religious wars, religious persecutions, heretical tribunals, that breaking of idols and destruction of images of thegods, that razing of Indian temples, and Egyptian colossi, which had looked on the sun 3,000 years, just because a jealous god had said, "Thou shalt make no graven image." But to return to the chief point. You are certainly right in insisting on the strong metaphysical needs of mankind, but religion appears to me to be not so much a satisfaction as an abuse of those needs. At any rate we have seen that in regard to the furtherance of morality, its utility is, for the most part, problematical, its disadvantages, and especially the atrocities which have followed in its train, are patent to the light of day. Of course it is quite a different matter if we consider the utility of religion as a prop of thrones, for where these are held, by the grace of God, throne and altar are intimately associated, and every wise prince who loves his throne and his family will appear at the head of his people as an exemplar of true religion. Even Machiavelli, in the 18th chapter of his book, most earnestly recommended religion to princes. Beyond this, one may say that revealed religions stand to philosophy exactly in the relation of sovereigns by the grace of God to the sovereignty of the people, so that the two former terms of the parallel are in natural alliance. Demophiles. Oh, don't take that tone. You're going hand in hand with ochlocracy and anarchy, the arch-enemy of all legislative order, all civilization, and all humanity. Philolaethes. You are right. It was only a sophism of mine, what the fencing master calls a feint. I retract it. But see how disputing sometimes makes an honest man unjust and malicious. Let us stop. Demophiles. I can't help regretting that, after all the trouble I've taken, I haven't altered your disposition in regard to religion. On the other hand, I can assure you that everything you have said hasn't shaken my conviction of its high value and necessity. Philolaethes. I fully believe you, for, as we may read in Hudibras, a man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still. My consolation is that, alike in controversies and in taking mineral waters, the after effects are the true ones. Demophiles. Well, I hope it'll be beneficial in your case. Philolaethes. It might be so, if I could digest a certain Spanish proverb. Demophiles. Vhvhs. Philolaethes. Behind the cross stands the devil. Demophiles. Come, don't let us part with sarcasms. Let us rather admit that religion, like Janus, or better still, like the Brahmin god of death, Yama, has two faces, and like him, one friendly, the other sullen. Each of us has kept his eye fixed on one alone. Philolaethes. You are right, old fellow. A few words on pantheism. The controversy between theism and pantheism might be presented in an allegorical or dramatic form by supposing a dialogue between two persons in the pit of a theatre at Milan during the performance of a piece. One of them, convinced that he is in Girolamo's renowned marionette theatre, admires the art by which the director gets up the dolls and guides their movements. "Oh, you are quite mistaken," says the other, "we're in the Teatro della Scala, it is the manager and his troupe who are on the stage. They are the persons you see before you, the poet too is taking a part." The chief objection I have to pantheism is that it says nothing. To call the world God is not to explain it, it is only to enrich our language with a superfluous synonym for the word world. It comes to the same thing whether you say, the world is God, or, God is the world. But if you start from God as something that is given in experience, and has to be explained, and they say, God is the world, you are affording what is to some extent an explanation, in so far as you are reducing what is unknown to what is partly known, ignotum per notius, but it is only a verbal explanation. If, however, you start from what is really given, that is to say, from the world, and say, the world is God, it is clear that you say nothing, or at least you are explaining what is unknown by what is more unknown. Hence, pantheism presupposes theism, only in so far as you start from a God, that is, In so far as you possess him as something with which you are already familiar, can you end by identifying him with the world, and your purpose in doing so is to put him out of the way in a decent fashion. In other words, you do not start clear from the world as something that requires explanation, you start from God as something that is given, and not knowing what to do with him, you make the world take over his role. This is the origin of pantheism. Taking an unprejudiced view of the world as it is, no one would dream of regarding it as a god. It must be a very ill-advised God who knows no better way of diverting himself than by turning into such a world as ours, such a mean, shabby world, there to take the form of innumerable millions who live indeed, but are fretted and tormented, and who manage to exist a while together, only by praying on another, to bear misery, need and death, without measure, and without in the form, for instance, of millions of Negro slaves, or of the 3 million weavers in Europe who, in hunger and care, lead a miserable existence in damp rooms or the cheerless halls of a factory. Vivi had a pastime this for a god, who must, as such, be used to another mode of existence. We find accordingly that what is described as the great advance from theism to pantheism, if looked at seriously, and not simply as a masked negation of the sort indicated above, is a transition from what is unproved and hardly conceivable to what is absolutely absurd. For however obscure, however loose, or confused may be the idea which we connect with the word God, there are two predicates which are inseparable from it, the highest power and the highest wisdom. It is absolutely absurd to think that a being endowed with these qualities should have put himself into the position described above. Theism, on the other hand, is something which is merely unproved, and if it is difficult to look upon the infinite world as the work of a personal, and therefore individual, being, the like of which we know only from our experience of the animal world, it is nevertheless not an absolutely absurd idea. That a being, at once almighty and all good, should create a world of torment is always conceivable, even though we do not know why he does so, and accordingly we find that when people ascribe the height of goodness to this being, they set up the inscrutable nature of his wisdom as the refuge by which the doctrine escapes the charge of absurdity. Pantheism, however, assumes that the creative God is himself the world of infinite torment, and, in this little world alone, dies every second, and that entirely of his own will, which is absurd. It would be much more correct to identify the world with the devil, as the venerable author of the Deutsche Theologie has, in fact, done in a passage of his immortal work, where he says, Vivi herefore the evil spirit and nature are one, and where nature is not overcome, neither is the evil adversary overcome. It is manifest that the pantheists give the Sansara the name of God. The same name is given by the mystics to the nirvana. The latter, however, state more about the nirvana than they know, which is not done by the Buddhists, whose nirvana is accordingly a relative nothing. It is only Jews, Christians, and Mohammedans who give its proper and meaning to the word God. The expression, often heard nowadays, the world is an end in itself, leaves it uncertain whether pantheism or a simple fatalism is to be taken as the explanation of it. But, whichever it be, the expression looks upon the world from a physical point of view only, and leaves out of sight its moral significance, because you cannot assume a moral significance without presenting the world as means to a higher end. The notion that the world has a physical but not a moral meaning, is the most mischievous error sprung from the greatest mental perversity. On books and reading. Ignorance is degrading only when found in company with riches. The poor man is restrained by poverty and need, labor occupies his thoughts, and takes the place of knowledge. But rich men who are ignorant live for their lusts only, and are like the beasts of the field, as may be seen every day, and they can also be reproached for not having used wealth and leisure for that which gives them their greatest value. When we read, another person thinks for us, we merely repeat his mental process. In learning to write, the pupil goes over with his pen what the teacher has outlined in pencil, so in reading, the greater part of the work of thought is already done for us. This is why it relieves us to take up a book after being with our own thoughts. And in reading, the mind is, in fact, only the playground of another's thoughts. It comes about that if anyone spends almost the whole day in reading, and by way of relaxation devotes the intervals to some thoughtless pastime, he gradually loses the capacity for thinking, just as the man who always rides, at last forgets how to walk. This is the case with many learned persons, they have read themselves stupid. For to occupy every spare moment in reading, and to do nothing but read, is even more paralyzing to the mind than constant manual labor, which at least allows those engaged in it to follow their own thoughts. A spring never free from the pressure of some foreign body at last loses its elasticity, and so does the mind if other people's thoughts are constantly forced upon it. Just as you can ruin the stomach and impair the whole body by taking too much nourishment, so you can overfill and choke the mind by feeding it too much. The more you read, the fewer are the traces left by what you have read. The mind becomes like a tablet crossed over and over writing. There is no time for ruminating, and in no other way can you assimilate what you have read. If you read on and on without setting your own thoughts to work, what you have read cannot strike root, and is generally lost. It is, in fact, just the same mental as with bodily food, hardly the fifth part of what one takes is assimilated. The rest passes off in evaporation, respiration, and the like. The result of all this is that thoughts put on paper are nothing more than footsteps in the sand. You see the way the man has gone, but to know what he saw on his walk, you want his eyes. There is no quality of style that can be gained by reading writers who possess it, whether it be persuasiveness, imagination, the gift of drawing comparisons, bitterness, brevity, grace, ease of expression or wit, unexpected contrasts, a laconic or naive manner, and the like. But if these qualities are already in us, exist, that is to say, potentially, we can call them forth and bring them to consciousness, we can learn the purposes to which they can be put, we can be strengthened in our inclination to use them, or get courage to do so, we can judge by examples the effect of applying them, and so acquire the correct use of them. And of course it is only when we have arrived at that point that we actually possess these qualities. The only way in which reading can form style is by teaching us the use to which we can put our own natural gifts. We must have these gifts before we begin to learn the use of them. Without them, reading teaches us nothing but cold, dead mannerisms and makes us shallow imitators. The strata of the earth preserve in rows the creatures which lived in former ages, and the array of books on the shelves of a library stores up in like manner the errors of the past and the way in which they have been exposed. Like those creatures, they too were full of life in their time, and made a great deal of noise, but now they are stiff and fossilized, and an of curiosity to the literary paleontologist alone. Herodotus relates that Xerxes wept at the sight of his army, which stretched further than the eye could reach, in the thought that of all these, after 100 years, not one would be alive. And in over a huge catalogue of new books, one might weep at thinking that, when 10 years have passed, not one of them will be heard of. It is in literature as in life, wherever you turn, you stumble at once upon the incorrigible mob of humanity, swarming in all directions, crowding and soiling everything, like flies in summer. Hence the number, which no man can count, of bad books, those rank weeds of literature, which draw nourishment from the corn and choke it. The time, money, and attention of